Welcome to Just Settled. I'm Dan Taft, the host of Just Settled. On today's pod, we have Stephen Litner, amazing PI attorney out of Boston, Massachusetts, partner at Rawson, Merrigan and Litner. Stephen, thank you so much for joining Just Settled.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and so we can kind of dive right in here. This case that you sent over that we were talking about is very interesting and obviously a difficult one for the client who went through so much, but obviously they were very lucky to find you to represent them. And I'll kind of let you dive into all of the details. We can just kind of start with a general overview of when you first learned about this case. How did it come across your desk? What were your initial thoughts when you kind of got the details in?
Thank you. So, yeah, this was a very, very difficult set of circumstances for this gentleman. He, at the time, was 32 years old. He was an immigrant from Guatemala, and was a carpenter by his trade.
Okay.
He was referred to me by a former client of mine, that lived in the same area that this gentleman lived in. And I mean, this gentleman's life was devastated. I mean, he clearly was someone that lived check to check. He
Mm,
had a girlfriend, and she was pregnant with their child. And back in September of 2014, he was working at a housing construction project, where they were building multiple homes, and working for a subcontractor. And he was on the roof of one of these houses, and for a number of reasons that we were able to establish, he was caused to fall from the roof and suffered permanent and just massive damage to his back. He suffered a fracture at T9, which is the lower part of your thoracic spine. That damaged his spinal cord. He had a fracture at T8, and they did an emergency spinal fusion when he was transported from the scene. But unfortunately, ultimately ended up with a complete and permanent spinal cord injury. So he is permanently disabled from the waist down. Um, when he came to me, the immediate concerns were, what am I going to do? Where am I going to
right.
live? How am I going to survive? And there were a number of things that went into play. And the reason why I chose to talk about this case is not just the result on the financials. I know that's the easy thing, is just to pick what's
Sure.
the biggest resolution you've had. But I think this was at a time in my practice where I was practicing it for about 20 years. And it really
Mm,
brought together so many different facets of the things that I had worked on and I had learned in my experience, that it required everything I had and everything that I was capable of to try to make this right as efficiently as I could, because no money was coming in.
right.
He could not, when he was discharged from the hospital, he could not go back to the place he was living. It was not handicapped accessible. So there were just a lot of different things that came into play. And the first focus, and you can stop me whenever you'd like, but the first focus was dealing with workers' compensation. So, like most states, Massachusetts, workers' comp's not a choice. It's
Mm,
an operation of law. So when someone hurts themselves while they're in the course of their employment, they're automatically, there's a workers' compensation claim, which essentially pays for all of the medical treatment and then a portion of the wages. What added difficulty to this case was, as is true with a lot of immigrants, is that he was paid under the table.
mm,
There wasn't a great record of, let's say, you represent a plumber that works for Acme Plumbing and you can see their pay stubs every
right.
week. So it was very difficult to establish definitively who he worked for and what his earnings were. So it took a good deal of time and as aggressively as I could to try to get that squared away. Um, and that was just the beginning, to get some checks starting to come for him. But what I was able to do, and really the insurance companies, especially on the comp side, were good to deal with. And that's not always the case, but in this
Right.
situation they were. And we were able to do a number of things for him, to where I was able to get him into an accessible apartment where the insurance company, through negotiation, paid for the difference between what he had been paying and what the added cost was.
Okay.
And then ultimately, what was important about this case was, and I'm sure your listeners, followers probably know this, but workers' comp has what's called an exclusivity provision, which
Right.
means you don't have to prove someone's at fault to be entitled to workers' comp. So even if someone's lifting a box or the boss leaves a banana peel on the kitchen floor, either way, as long as the individual was in the course of their employment, they're entitled to those benefits. The negative is that you can't sue your employer. So if the cause of this gentleman's horrific injury was his coworker or his employer, he wouldn't have been able to do anything other than what workers' comp provides, which,
Mm,
as I stated, is the medical bills and a portion of the wages. But what that leaves out is pain and suffering
right.
and all the other things that flow from a negligence case. So what we were able to do as aggressively as possible is make sure that, because the initial workers' comp was being paid by the general contractor on the job.
Yeah.
So it wasn't easy, but we were able to get the comp to be paid through his true employer, which there was very little record, which was the subcontractor. And not only were we able to work that out in terms of his comp, but that then opened up the prospect of the third party claim against the general contractor, in which we were able to establish a number of transgressions that the
Mm.
general contractor um, uh, was responsible for, that we felt strongly was a large reason for the fall and the injury. So
Yeah, and I read about some of that in the overview that you sent over,
sure,
and a lot of that sounded like a failure to train, right, and kind of failure to provide certain safety precautions or equipment that seemed like it was necessary in this or should have been there. Um,
exactly.
in terms of the case's potential outcome, what were some of your bigger concerns and uncertainties around that? Were those centered around the fact that he was, um, not a documented immigrant, or I don't know exactly what the wording is there. I mean, how
Yeah, no,
challenging was that, and kind of
I,
how did you work around it?
to be honest, one of the most challenging things, and this is something they don't teach you in law school or not in
Yeah.
books, is there was touch and go with my client a few times
Mm,
where things weren't happening as quickly, and this was a lot was at stake, and there were occasions where I was concerned that he might look for a new lawyer just
mm,
because they're in a small community. Everybody knows a lawyer and knows whatever. So it was really difficult. I had to really do not just work on the nuts and bolts of his case, but do everything I could to let him know that I was there for him, that I was
sure.
fighting for him, so that was a big part of it. Not really, and to this day, he's still someone that I correspond with, that we touch base with on occasion and exchange texts on birthdays and things, because
That's great.
it was really important to make sure he knew that that was happening. So one of the biggest things that a lot of lawyers would tell you is to establish that level of trust. And when someone's an immigrant and when someone doesn't speak English as their first language, that can be a challenge in and of
Mm,
itself, is
right.
establishing that. But like you said, from the legal perspective, some of the issues were, it was very difficult with witnesses, because a lot of the witnesses and workers that were there on the job were similarly situated, and they don't want to be there and giving out their name and their information. So that was challenging. Now,
Hmm.
fortunately, there was OSHA investigated it. So
Okay.
they were out, and there was some good documented evidence that I was able to use from that. So the challenge again was to get the workers' comp squared away, to do that as aggressively as possible, to get him having some income coming in, get his living situation squared away, get the workers' comp with the correct employer and insurer, ultimately get that in a good spot, get him some available resources through comp, and then bring our direction to the third party claim. And things just, it fell into place. It took time and it was touch and go, but it fell into place. And ultimately, I feel comfortable that he's in a position now where he can care for himself and care
Right.
for his family, and there were challenges there, but it really, if this case came across my desk when I was 3 or 4 years out of school, I don't know if all of what I learned and the relationships that I've been able to foster over the years, it would have been that much more difficult. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of those things came into play. But first and foremost, remembering not only am I a lawyer, but I'm a human, and I have to be able to show my client that human side, that I'm doing everything I can as aggressively as I can for him. So as I think back, that was probably honestly the biggest challenge, was just maintaining his level of confidence and trust that it was going to work out. It was just
Mm.
going to take time.
Want to share your settlement success stories? Join us as a guest on the Just Settled podcast. Visit our Instagram at Just Settled Case and click on the link at the top of the page to set up your interview today. Speaking of his level of trust and sort of his expectations going in, did you guys discuss possible ranges of restitution, or what were the expectations for restitution? Obviously, there ended up being multiple angles in terms of how that played out in this case. How did you sort of perceive the estimated value, or what you were trying to get for him in the beginning?
At the beginning was really the workers' comp part of it. It
Right.
was I was able to secure a there's a section of the workers' comp statute in Massachusetts
Mm,
that is for it's called for loss of function or disfigurement.
okay.
Um, and a lot of insurers will only pay that aspect of it at the time of the, if there is going to be a resolution to the comp claim. I was able to get them to pay a very significant sum of that much earlier in the process than what normally happens.
Okay.
And he was really just concerned about today and tomorrow, and not about next week and next month. And that's one of the difficult things. So I really, as I always try to do, what I know, I want my clients to know, because I don't want my clients to, I never hear from my lawyer. I don't know what's going on.
Right.
So I
Right.
made sure that he did. And then once he saw that things were going to be okay, then I could have real discussions with him about, and what we did, we settled his comp claim, which is called the lump sum,
Mm,
uh, to resolve his comp claim. That basically paid him the maximum amount the law entitles to him
okay.
throughout what, until he's 68 years old, and they paid that all up front based on his comp rate. So that worked out. And then we turned our case to the third party case against the general contractor. And I aggressively presented a really strong demand letter and multiple discussions. And on the eve of getting a lawsuit filed with them, they tendered their full policy limit. So
Yeah, that's great.
yeah, so for our client, not only was able to have those benefits early on, or fairly early on in the case, and then resolve his workers' comp claim, but then be able to get the full resolution of the available coverage in the third party. And it just really made sense for him. And we avoided, which could have been a long and drawn out litigation, and you never know what'll happen. So I think
Right.
ultimately, things, as horrible of a situation it is, I'm very, I know he's very happy with the work that I performed, and I'm happy with what I was able to accomplish for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the outcome you were able to get. You outlined some of the unique challenges of this case. What were some of kind of like the typical obstacles or things that kind of are coming? How did those play out in this case, and how did you kind of navigate the stuff that is kind of, I guess, what's more par for the course through this kind of case? What benchmarks do you know are coming at each point in them?
Um, the on the workers' comp side of it, I
Yeah.
think what was beneficial was that there was some of there were a couple of different lawyers on the insurer side, and that I had, over the course of my career, been able to develop a good level of mutual respect. And I think that helped. I think absent that, things could have really drawn out for a lot longer,
Okay.
and could have presented a lot more issues. So I knew that one of the biggest issues was going to be the lack of documentation. I'm not talking about his immigrant status, but the
Sure.
lack of documentation of what his earnings were and who was paying him.
Mhm.
That's a real challenge to be able to establish, because everything that flows from workers' comp is really based on what the individual's average weekly wage is. And when you can't establish that, it can be really problematic. So
Yeah.
that was one issue. Fortunately, we were able to, through subpoena, get some decent records establishing what he and what similar situated employees on the job site were earning.
Right.
Um, so that was one definite concern. And again, I know I keep going back to it, but the other concern was just if my client just lost confidence and somebody was in his ear and he went somewhere else. And it happens all the time. And
Yeah.
that's really, really hard because they don't, a lot of people they just don't understand. And they, so that was consistently a challenge to a lot of the
No,
case.
I
And
could imagine.
yeah, yeah,
You said the accident happened in September of 2014, right? So
yep.
what did the full timeline of this case look like from start to finish? How long did it take to actually reach these settlements and outcomes? In today's digital landscape, a strong social media presence holds significant importance for legal professionals. Recognizing this need, Practice 360 by LegalSoft is pleased to announce an exclusive promotion offering a comprehensive law practice social media solution free of charge for 30 days. Practice 360 is the all in one solution to elevate your law firm. Access a suite of services, including personalized mobile apps, website development, PR, and social media management. With everything centralized, say goodbye to juggling multiple providers. Elevate your firm's success with Practice 360 today. How long did it take to actually reach these settlements and outcomes?
About a year and a half,
Okay.
which is not super long when it comes to an outcome
Yeah.
of this number. Some things broke right. I mean, and lawyers will understand that sometimes you can't control how much insurance coverage there is.
Right.
Whether you get a call, and we get calls all the time where someone's involved in a horrific car accident, but there's just a very limited amount of coverage. It's the one thing I can't change.
Right.
Um, so here, the amount of coverage that the general contractor who we brought the third party claim was significant, but not so significant that I wasn't their job as an insurance company is certainly not to pay me, and it's really not to pay my client. It's to
Right.
protect their insured.
Mhm.
So sometimes if there's a massive, massive, massive insurance policy, an insurance company has less to worry about in terms of a verdict in excess of the limits against their insured. So they can be, and often are, much more difficult to deal with and much more willing to fight in the thought that if they drag it out, my client at some point is gonna be willing to take less money, or they'll be able to establish something that would cause us real concern about our ability to win the case. So the amount of coverage they had broke right. It was a
Okay.
significant amount of coverage, but not so much where I couldn't say to them, look, I'm going to file this suit. This is what we have for Evan. This is what's going to happen. And if I file suit, my client's not going to be willing to accept your policy limit to resolve this case. So I was able to exert enough pressure to where things broke right and they offered their limit.
Yeah, that's great. At what point in that timeline did you kind of realize a settlement was likely, as opposed to them pushing this into court? When did you kind of know that they were looking to settle?
Um,
And I know it was a couple of different entities you named.
yeah,
Maybe there was a second one that.
once the workers' comp, once I got the comp, the two things to get the correct
Mhm.
insurer so that there was no exclusivity problem. And I was also able to get him on the highest rate possible under mass law. Once those things broke right for me, and I was able to really focus on the third party claim, I felt confident. But it wasn't until I had a number of discussions with the senior supervisor at the insurer that I
Okay.
did get the impression that they were going to resolve the claim.
And in terms of the negotiation process, because you touched on this before, obviously the insurance company always wants to minimize or pay nothing. It's like they'll lowball, they're going to do that. How
Yeah.
did you advocate for your client's interest in this case? What did that negotiation back and forth look like?
So I do that every day. This case, it wasn't so much that way because what I did was, which I found to be quite an effective tool, is
Mm,
when you do a letter to an insurance company, and it can be this case or others, and you can't demand $100,000 just because that's what the Paul this coverage was a lot more than that. But just taking another example, if you have a car accident case and the tortfeasor has $100,000 policy, you
mm,
can't demand 100,000. A lot of attorneys do that on every case. You have to have the injuries, the damages, the financials to support something like that. But
right.
I have found is very, very successful for us and for me is if you do a demand and you have a reasonable case on the merits that warrants that coverage, that
Sure.
full coverage, by presenting a demand above the amount of coverage, but saying that, Mike, however, and as long as you have the authority of your client, my client is willing to accept payment of your policy. If you pay that within 30 days, if you do not, at the conclusion of the 30 days, I'm filing suit. The demand, the offer to resolve at the policy is revoked in exchange for a demand of whatever that might be, 2 or 3 times the policy. And then you also precisely ask them to convey this proposal to their insured, the person they insure. And
Mhm.
I have found when you do that, it does put an insurer in a tough spot because again, they're not there to pay me or my client. They're there to
Sure.
protect their insured. So when I'm in litigation, if it doesn't happen, I'm fully capable and can, there's nothing that stops me from asking their insured at a deposition, do you know and were you advised by your insurer that my client was willing to resolve this case for payment of your policy limit? And you'd be surprised how many times that's news
Right.
to the person you're bringing a case against. So in this case, they knew that either they were going to pay their full limit or it was going to be litigation. And I think I believe they made the right decision in protecting their insured.
Yeah.
Now, if they didn't and they decided to fight this case, I don't know. You never know what could happen with litigation, with
Mhm.
a jury, with a verdict. But here, there wasn't, well, we're willing to offer this. I made it really clear this was their window, and they chose to pay what was demanded.
Okay. Um, what was that in terms of the total final outcome? And again, I know there was multiple components of that, but what did the final outcome of the settlement look like in total? And how did that positively impact your client's life
Sure.
moving
So
forward?
the workers' comp carrier initially paid, and this was not part of the settlement. It was separate from
Mhm.
the settlement. They paid about 225,000
Okay.
fairly early on. Once I got it squared away, who the correct carrier was through some litigation. So they paid the 225 that really went right to my client. Then they also paid for the housing for an extended period. Then
Mhm.
we were able to settle the workers' comp claim via lump sum for just under 900,000,
Wow.
which again, that's not that does not incorporate pain and suffering. And
Sure.
when you have a gentleman that is only making $600 or $700 a week, if you take that amount, that's a lot of weeks and years worth
Sure.
of weekly checks.
Mhm.
And so that got squared away. And then sometime later, we were able to resolve his general liability case or his case against the general contractor for $3 million.
Oh,
So
okay.
how it impacted his life, well, he's a proud dad. His son now is, 10 or 11 years old at this point. He bought a house. He has a business, and he's very happy. Um, he's made some progress through a lot of therapy with certain equipment. He can walk some short distances. And, I am I think one of the things I took from him was he was so afraid that he lost his identity, that his girlfriend would leave him, that his son would be born without a father that could care for him. And I I don't think he feels that way any longer. I think he feels like the person that he is, and although he suffered this really horrific injury, that he's made a life for his now wife and his son. So
That's
I
amazing.
think that helped. Yeah, that helped.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing this story with us today on Just Settled, Stephen. Again, Stephen Litner, incredible PI lawyer. Client was obviously very lucky to find you, and it sounds like you learned a lot along the way as well, which is always the best. When, to your point, you make that human connection. Obviously, it really helps somebody. Stephen, tell our audience where they can find you.
Sure. So again, my firm is Rawson Merrigan Litner, right in Boston, 185 Devonshire Street. My number at the office is 617-348-0988. And my email is Stephen with a V dot Litner, Litner at rml-lawyers.com. And I'm easily found. I give all my clients my cell number, which drives my wife crazy a lot, but
Yeah.
it's what I'd want as an attorney, and it's what I try to provide. So if anyone has questions or just anything, I'm around. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. We hope to have you back on soon.